All right, I think you can get started. Thank you so much for being here, Kofi, and thank you to all our attendees for joining for tonight's conversation. My name is Annie Heener. I'm a landscape designer at PEA Group in Michigan. I'm also a member of the Michigan ASLA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So our committee hosts this series of webinars in order to highlight minority designers and students and professionals while providing a platform to hear about their experiences within the profession, their journey as a designer, or specific topics which interest them. So we're very excited and honored to feature this month's speaker, Kofi Boone. Kofi is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architecture and is the Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor and University Faculty Scholar at NC State University. Kofi is also a Detroit native and a graduate of the University of Michigan. His work is in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice, with specializations in democratic design and the interpretation of cultural landscapes. Kofi's teaching and professional work have earned both student and professional ASLA awards. He is the president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation and serves on the boards of the Black Landscape Architects Network, as well as the Black Land Loss Prevention Project. So he'll be speaking tonight on the topic of ecologies of capabilities. Please feel free to type questions into the chat, the Q&A throughout the seminar, as we'll address those after the presentation. So Kofi, thank you so much for sharing your time with us tonight, and take it away.
Happy to do it. Glad to have been invited, and always glad to talk with people from Michigan, which is my home. Even though I'm in North Carolina, I still consider Detroit and Michigan my home. And for the people who are from Detroit, we'll just say what up though, which is our greeting. But with your permission, I'll share screen and we'll get started with this topic. This is a topic that we spent a lot of time thinking about, especially recently in the past 2 years after the twin pandemics, what we're still facing with COVID-19 and what we're still facing in the aftermath of the racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And so, how can we think of the socio-economic and cultural components of what we do as landscape architects with the same level of complexity and connections that we do for the other parts of our environment or the ecological pieces. So the ecologies of capabilities is really presenting that as an idea. Can we fold in and address pressing social cultural issues through the work that we do? As mentioned, I'm a Detroit native, and although I've been away from home for a long period of time, I hold Detroit and my experiences growing up there close to my heart. They inform everything that I do. And so although there are many stories about Detroit and that are spread all over the world and definitely all over the country, my memories of Detroit are really positive. So this is just an image of kids playing in the Detroit River off the shore of Belle Isle Park, looking back at downtown. So I grew up on the east side of Detroit. My parents really steered us into academic pathways early. I ended up getting really interested in art and music. The landscape was really important to my upbringing and how I grew up. So this is another view of Belle Isle Park, which was about 20 minutes biking from my house. It was the closest large public park to where I lived, and we used it for everything. Growing up, though, I had cultural experiences as well. So this is Georgia Namdi. So for people familiar with the city of Detroit, the Namdi Center near the Medical Center in Detroit is a premier sort of cultural campus. And I actually went to the school that Mr. and Mrs. Namdi started, the Taki Taliba Schoolhouse in Detroit. So from a very early age was connected to those things. And something that surprises people who aren't from Michigan and aren't from Detroit is the rich built heritage that is in Southeast Michigan. Much of it either preceding, coming right before the Great Depression in the 1930s and after World War II. The huge boom in the postmodern era So spent a lot of time on Cranbrook's campus, designed by the Saarinen, and really an icon of modernist landscape architecture. But also spent a lot of time closer to where I was from, where I grew up, and where I spent my time as a young person. This is the Heidelberg Project. So something that has a completely different take on the state of people, the value of place, the value of design as a way to infuse a sense of place and a sense of belonging, and a social critique. The other way to read the Heidelberg Project, which is, as I understand it, in the process of being deconstructed by the artist Tyree Guyton. It really is a social commentary in addition to it being really an overwhelming piece of art. I had abilities in music, so that took me through scholarship up into Northern Michigan. So I went to high school at Interlochen Arts Academy in Northern Michigan, about 25 minutes away from Traverse City. And for me, that was a big shock to the system, where most of my life as a young person was dominated by an urban environment. This was the first time that I was really surrounded by state parks, and it was on a math and science camping trip on North Manitou Island that I revealed to myself that I actually had a love of ecology and a love of environment. And that's where these dots started to connect in terms of, well, what's my place in the world? What's the value of landscape? What's my connection? And how do I pursue that as a way to go? I went to the University of Michigan and got exposed to not just landscape architecture, but also leading scholars in the environmental justice movement. So people like Bunyan Bryant, Paul Mohai, and Dorsita Taylor, who I understand has recently moved on to Yale, but also uncovering things that were really interesting about my hometown I didn't even know. So introduced to people like Grace Lee Boggs, Grace and James Boggs. And this quote is one of my favorite quotes about belonging and taking responsibility of places for changing them. And of course, the Boggs story and the Boggs Center is one of the great national centers for community action and community-based work. While in school, also got exposed to landscape architects who were thinking in the same way in some cases in other parts of the country. So Ann Winston-Spurn, who at this time was at University of Pennsylvania, founds the West Philadelphia Landscape Project and starts to engage the communities around Penn and starts to, in early GIS studies, analyze communities, trying to figure out with homeowners why homes were deteriorating at rapid rates in the same places where all these broader social cultural issues, and starts to uncover that the community was built in the floodplain of a stream that was put in a pipe, Old Mill Creek. And so, in her own initiative, went another step forward and started to engage elementary schools and curriculum and start to help children start to think about how they could use their own neighborhoods as ways to learn about science and technology, engineering and math, but in applied ways, practical ways that provided skills and exposure to help them become forces for change in their communities. Early pioneer in citizen science and mapping using GIS technologies, high achieving with the students once they started to see the relevance of what they were learning applied to conditions in their neighborhood, huge increases in school performance, participating in the installation of rain gardens, community gardens, all kinds of stuff. And although the broader vision that they proposed at that time in Philadelphia, essentially daylighting Mill Creek, allowing the floodplain to operate as it's supposed to as a floodplain, but also to bring amenity and resource depth to the community, that broader vision was never fulfilled. The incremental parts along the way remain. So Aspen Farm, which that's a photo that I took several years ago when the ASLA meeting was in Philadelphia, and still operating and thriving as a place providing access to fresh food to people in Philadelphia. And the lady on the right was a child at the time that the West Philadelphia Project was going on. And one of the things they learned as children interacting with Penn faculty and students was how to code, so sort of a skill that was related to the project at hand, but it was something that was portable they could take with them. And she built a whole career and now teaches coding to people in West Philadelphia. So this idea of capabilities and how landscape can start to become this scaffold that enables other things to occur in addition to the direct environmental benefits is something that I was, exposed to and steeped in. And as a board member of the Core Network, I had the pleasure of returning to Philadelphia last year in the throes of COVID, but to interact with Power Core, which is a group that is talking about really building these particular capabilities in practical ways. So taking young people who may not have performed as well in school, that come from homes that aren't most stable or have some connection to the criminal justice system, and through leadership, through family skill building, personal skill building, leading them on a path to certification in green technologies. And so this was money that was directed towards, similar to Detroit, CSO work, combined sewer overflow work. The alternative proposed in Philadelphia was this decentralized green infrastructure moving throughout the city that required a workforce to build them and to maintain them. And so it was within that niche that PowerCore kind of jumped in. And so now there are hundreds of young people who are moving through these processes, and will be able to make a life working on green infrastructure in their hometown. So, this is something that's important. And in my own life, after I graduated from Michigan, interned at Carroll Johnson Associates at Cambridge, Massachusetts, returned home and worked for then JJR, now Smith Group. It was really wonderful to participate in a transformation, of course, the Detroit riverfront. And now as president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, the case study investigation series, which talks about performance measures. Also, thrilled to see it included as one of the case studies, a very powerful case study for the many benefits it provides, in addition to the ones we can see. But, something that was different, from my corporate life and my early life to my life now, was my experience in the South, and learning about the many things that we didn't talk about in landscape architecture, in our education, in our history, in our values, and how critical some of those conversations are for us to move forward, particularly in this century, to deal with the scale and scope of the challenges that we face as a profession and as a society. One of those was acknowledgement and recognition of Indigenous people and Indigenous land. So I come to you from the land of the Eno and the Saponi and the Shakori and the Cherokee, and ask permission to share these words on this land. And particularly in the South, as Michigan was the other end of the Underground Railroad, people were fleeing from where I am now in North Carolina, and particularly what used to be called the Confederate States of America. And although there's a lot of perceptions about, does that really matter? And that was so long ago, I can say it does in many ways in the South, in terms of explaining patterns of disparities in health and life expectancy and education and income, that a lot of these are deeply entrenched things tied to place. And so this map is really important to me regarding teaching and introducing where I am now, which is acknowledging slavery and enslavement, and that the landscape enabled that, particularly in the South. The map is hard to read from a distance, but generally the darker the areas on the map, those are by county, the higher the concentration of enslaved African people. And it also works as a geography map. You can see the darkest areas along the Mississippi River and its delta, as well as South Carolina. So in a way, the perception of the landscape as having value for plantations drove high concentrations of enslavement. And when you layer that era of enslavement with the dispossession of Native people in indigenous land, these are two very contemporary conversations, because we very rarely talk about that and what that means for our profession. So I wanted to introduce that, because there was someone who thought about that we're celebrating his 200th birthday this year, Frederick Olmsted. And so he was very interested in the roles that the landscape can play in enabling social, political, and economic change. Part of his life before landscape architecture was walking the American South as under a pen name, but as a writer for what then became the New York Times. An abolitionist, he wrote about the conditions on plantations in the South, and those letters were bundled into the book on the left, The Cotton Kingdom, which I highly recommend. He also toured Europe, visited Europe, and visited the former royal grounds of the English aristocracy that were turned over to public use as public parks, particularly for working class people and industrial populations, for various purposes, which we can talk about later. But this idea of, as an abolitionist, observing these social injustices in the South, married with the strategy that was, in some sense, pioneered in England, turning over public lands in populated cities for public use as a way to deal with those particular issues. He really was the synthesizer. He talked about how those two things are really relevant. And I know in Detroit, Olmsted's legacy is broad. I know he's not the designer of Belle Isle Park. He started it in Detroit fashion. They ran him out of town. So Belle Isle is sort of a collage, so to speak, but did design Palmer Park, and with a lot of the same spirit. And it was nice to see recent publications that talk about the people's plan for Palmer Park and faces and names that you may recognize in the pictures, because those are all prominent landscape architects and architects that have had deep ties to the city for a long period of time. But of course, most famous for Central Park. And for a lot of people who think that Central Park was already there, it was not. Every blade of grass, every tree that was planted, every path that was laid was designed and built. And its value was almost immeasurable. But as has been noted by many scholars, including one in Michigan, so UGG Davis Williams wrote an excellent article about bottoms, about sort of this correlation between race and opportunity based on geography. Includes a story of Central Park, which is important, about Seneca Village. Central Park was the home of several self-built communities before it became a park. Seneca Village was a community built by free African-American people, free Black people, numbering between 700 and 900 people, that was completely obliterated, in the footprint of Central Park. And as was noted by Dorceta Taylor, who used to be at University of Michigan, that even in the construction of Central Park, Frederick Olmsted would not hire Black laborers or Black people. So for all the benefits that we enjoy, there is a legacy of conflicting values, and in some cases displacement, and in some cases a perception that what we do as landscape architects is not necessarily universally seen as a good. In some cases, people are concerned that our investments may put them at risk. This ties into a broader pattern of outlined by Mindy Fool Thompson, the great book Root Shock, which talks about the mental and psychological impacts of losing one's home place, really focused on the Hill District of Pittsburgh, but also the South Bronx in New York, with the work of Robert Moses and others to really level that particular community through freeways and urban renewal. She illustrates that this pattern is repetitive. And so this idea of serial displacement, that this inability, in many cases due to public policy, for communities to stay rooted in place and to enjoy the benefits of all the wealth that is created, ecological, economic, and others. She cites redlining as one of those practices. So of course, the Homeowners Loan Corporation between 1925 and 1930, with the windshield survey of over 160 American cities, coding them for their suitability for investment for federal loans, uses race as the main determinant for being included in a red line. So literally a boundary that means that you're the highest risk, considered a hazardous risk for investment. And then The Color of Law by Rothstein, but even in the case for reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, in both cases, they're talking about this sort of generational impacts, the inability for these communities to attract loans, attract wealth, and how it helped them move down a slippery slope from denial of investments to declaration of slums to slum clearance, and then to urban renewal and freeway construction. It's almost a straight line. The black circle represents where I grew up, which was within a red line community. Hastings Street in Detroit, before and after freeway construction, the city of Detroit, of course, taking on strategies 375, the connector, to start to heal those wounds by turning that into urban boulevard. But you can see, that kind of destruction, not just in Detroit, but in many communities. And it's had lasting impacts because those physical transformations enable the decline of other systems that are required to lead and survive and thrive with a healthy lifestyle. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who has done a lot of research, but also talks about life expectancy based on zip code. Where I'm from, it's 7 years below the national average and 6 below the state average because of epidemiological factors that compromise our ability to breathe clean air, drink clean water, enjoy clean soil, live in safe communities with all the amenities that we need to survive. So there are many impacts to what we do. In the time we have, I wanted to walk through some things that are familiar. Often when I give a talk about this topic, it's in areas where there hasn't been as much experimentation and study and application and success and failure as Michigan and Detroit. So some of these topics may sound familiar, but so for those who've heard these stories before, I've just ask for some grace and say maybe this is reinforcement. But for people who are thinking about it for the first time, there's some questions that are really driving everyone now as we start to deal with the Anthropocene and the acknowledgement of climate change and the need to adapt. We think in some ways about the non-human factors now in the context of a circular economy. The great book Cradle to Cradle by McDonough really lays out this idea of how ecological cycles, what he calls natural systems, waste is recycled into the system. There's very little that falls outside of the system. It's used for everything. And waste equals food is the famous quote from that particular book. Well, he questions and asks whether or not industrial processes, human processes, can have the same idea. And that's grown up into this idea of the circular economy, where everything, starts from a renewable source and then natural capital and all of the elements that are tied to it. It just keeps cycling and cycling and cycling. It never leaves the system. And that's seen as a way to promote a level of sustainability. What we've asked recently is, can we think about people and social cultural systems in the same way? This is adapted from Sen, Arinyada Sen, who's a leading scholar for thinking about issues of sustainability globally, and mentioned this notion of capabilities, right? So this idea that individually, we're in pursuit of freedoms. We need to build our capabilities to reach those. That there's a lifestyle that we desire that pulls us along, and how do we make investments in our people and our places so that they can reach to those capabilities. So this model that was adapted for myself and a great friend, Julian Egeman, for an article in a book chapter that's coming out, starts to talk about what if we thought about that in common? Like, how can we start to use common things that we share as ways to attract investment and invest in capabilities so people can build freedoms, in a sense, the circular economy of people. Came to a head in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, of course, but one of the stories with George Floyd is he went to Jack Yates High School in Houston, Texas. Houston, along with Galveston, Texas, is significant because it's the birthplace of our most recent holiday, Juneteenth, where formerly enslaved African people, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, hear an announcement that reveals that, in fact, they are free. And there were many decisions that could have been made at that particular time. These people decided to invest and stay in place. Jack Yates is phenomenal in many ways, and I would encourage you all to look at his incredible transformative legacy in many arenas, but one of his major contributions was developing the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association in 1872. So what you see on the right is a faded photo of the group of people that were essentially the cooperative investors for this endeavor. They pool their money and they buy 12 acres in Houston and create an Emancipation Park, whose sole purpose is to celebrate emancipation in Juneteenth. It preceded the Houston public park system by many years. It was the first park in Houston. So when we start to talk about stories of, well, maybe people don't like investing, in their places, maybe where we work is geared towards other factors that are out of our control, or people don't have a legacy or a connection to investment that translates into landscape. This stands as maybe an example of a history we haven't examined, of saying that maybe it's the factors that we are trying to enable within investment in our public places that in some ways starts to filter who feels like they belong, whose voice is heard, who is not. So that's one of many examples. It's important because another contemporary issue that is more apparent in the South, but is true nationwide, is land loss. And it's really shocking in many communities how little the property and land is actually owned by the people that live there, local people. And with this renewed interest in investment in cities, a lot of that is global capital from places and from people who have no local connection to those places. In this case, in the South, just from 1920, due to policies from USDA, due to the Great Migration and people fleeing their land, due to some of the complexities of air right property, 98% of the land, rural land owned by African Americans, is now lost in the hands of others. That value, if you put a dollar figure on that value, is over $1 trillion. And you wonder about, in many cases, the poorest parts, at least of our state, North Carolina, but definitely across the South, rural, land rich, how much they could have done for schools, for education, for medicine, for all the things we know that are required to participate fairly in society. And there is no inventory of urban land. So we have no idea what the national percentages are of Black and African American land ownership in cities. So this is a major issue because a lot of what we do as landscape architects is activated by ownership and by capital. So if there are communities who are disenfranchised this systematically, it's something to pay attention to. Overcoming that barrier, there's an incredible history of Black cooperatives. This great book by Jessica Gordon Nemhart, Collective Courage, starts to talk about, at the same time that people are making decisions coming out of Reconstruction, coming out of the Jim Crow era, how do we start to, with meager means, pool our resources together to start businesses, to help people buy homes, to establish institutions, to do things that are rooted, right? Things that are connected. And one of the great champions of this idea was W.B. Du Bois, famous in many arenas, who wrote essentially numerous publications codifying this cooperative system. Like, how do we start to promote it, exchange it, use it as a best practice so that people can build up their resources. For some people, they may never heard of these cooperatives, but if you have HBO, like I do, you may watch The Watchmen. The opening episode of that incredible TV series was the bombing of the Greenwood District. That's now known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, which really happened, even though it was a fictional story. That event actually happened. What's important is that initially the Greenwood District, which at that time was the largest Black business district in the country, was built through cooperative means. It was not called Black Wall Street at the time of naming the Greenwood District. It was called Black Wall Street after it was rebuilt, almost immediately after that violent episode. It wasn't lost until urban renewal and freeway construction in the 1960s. So that's evidence of the spread of cooperatives. And where we are in Durham, North Carolina, which is in the Triangle region, we had a Black Wall Street too, for Mechanics and Farmers Bank and NC Mutual Life Insurance Company, which until the 1960s was the largest employer of African Americans in the country. So there are these legacies and stories that are really important to elevate and celebrate, so that we can start to talk about how do we build people's capabilities if the traditional means aren't affording those to occur. Malik Yakini, of course, who many of you already know, with D-Town Farms in Detroit, is a national champion of how to do this with food security and activating vacant land for access to fresh produce or fresh food. Growing up into Detroit People's Food Co-op, which has been moving forward, and it's been an area of great interest as we've been looking nationally. What's interesting about it, and people are wondering what's a tangible thing I can do about this particular issue. They're still campaigning, they're still fundraising for it. So their goal is 2,000 member owners. Looks like they need about 500 more. So if you are able, why not donate and invest and create a membership so that this important project can move forward to attack food insecurity in Southeast Michigan. With regards to land, the concept of the land trust is old. For people who know urban design history, even Ebenezer Howard, who theorized the Garden City model, thought of allotments and the idea of these common grounds as places that were removed from the private real estates or speculative market, but you could invest in and take with you whatever you've invested in them. As an old model. But in the United States context, it really gets codified in the 1960s. And it really was theorized as an extension of the modern civil rights movement, which was largely a political project that was moving into economics. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, the great founder of Mississippi Freedom Party, and founder of Mississippi Freedom Farms, like this idea of these very extremely poor sharecroppers across the South. If we acquired something like 1,000 acres and found a way to allow people to make investments and whatever they accrue from them, take them with them, but remove all land, private real estate forces from the equation. What that would do to lift, people out of poverty. This was codified by Charles Sherrod and Robert Swan in 1967, who wrote the first official guidelines for establishing community land trusts, which many of us know now, and is really popularized by the Schumacher Center. There are many, including I think a few in Detroit, but the most famous urban one is the Dudley Street Initiative in Boston, which has a great story. The short version of it is how resilient it is in terms of the wealth creation component with business creation, meaning that, the image there of Dudley Greenhouse and other businesses not having to deal with the speculative land costs, which have been spiking in Boston, as with many major cities. But a floor, right? So maybe not always wealth, but preventing people from falling out of the system and becoming housing or other system insecure, that the original area of the Dudley Street Initiative experienced the least amount of displacement due to foreclosures and due to increases in adjacent private property values. So the people who are most vulnerable were most stable in this particular model in a fast moving, fast growing city like Boston. And again, sort of bringing up these other stories and these other narratives that help us understand, how people who we don't usually include in the conversation of the story of landscape architecture actually did participate in this and are, continuing to seek tools through what we do. The Rondo community in St. Paul, Minneapolis is a fascinating community, a community middle class African Americans who built their wealth through cooperative ownership, as we've discussed before, who suffered the consequences of urban renewal and freeway construction, in this case I-94, which completely obliterated their business district. In the last 20 years, that community reorganized and then saying, hey, we need to identify and capture that history, capture that story, grow it up into a place that you can feel and touch and exchange with ideas. This small sort of outdoor gallery, museum space, and event space, which was right next to I-94, which you can see on the right, but with display panels, meeting places, ways to kind of enable that gathering and the social infrastructure required to push for bigger action. And a proposal that was seen as naive at the time, which was, put a cap on it. And in many cases, when we talk about, putting parks on top of freeways, we're thinking about recreation and leisure, but in their mind, the potential to put the business district back on top of the freeway. So this idea that moving from, and then using a land trust model to allow access by people who are, part of that particular community. So you get the cooperative, you get the land trust, you get the beginning, the instigator of that action growing up into, a broad urban plan. So I've been told that through current funds, through the Department of Transportation, that this may actually move forward. This might be on the list through DOT. So we're watching that area with a lot of interest. Two very quick stories, and then we'll close this out and be happy to answer any questions you may have. What we've tried to do through the university. So I teach at NC State University. It's a land grant institution. So our mandates include extension or service to the people of the state. And so we've run several studios and a lot of research projects with cooperatives and land trusts in our own backyard. So this is one. This is Green Rural Redevelopment Organization in Henderson, North Carolina. Those are the leaders of this particular organization here. There's a cooperative of Black farmers, micro market farmers, urban farmers, farmers on the fringe who have pooled their resources and know-how. And this required us to get an education in economics. And, they were trying to scale up their operation to be able to deliver fresh food to people who are being released from the hospital for treatment for cardiovascular disease tied to poor nutrition. So usually these people just get a box of generic food from any place that the federal government has a contract with. Could this be an opportunity to sort of capitalize and network and leverage local farming to provide the resources for that? So we had to do a lot of economics about food miles and a lot of things we normally don't do, but it gave us a really good lens in terms of what's required in order to enable, in order to build that particular capability. As you all well know in Michigan, the importance of partnerships with institutions. So the community colleges, the cities, the county entities, building those connections through what landscape architects I think do extremely well, which is facilitate and encourage collaboration across many silos and aisles. Some of our basic toolkit in terms of site analysis and understanding where the potentials are for, say, food production or other components of the food system, in this case, vacant and underutilized land amounting to 80 acres, which, if done well with contemporary techniques, intercropping, that kind of thing, amounts to about 4.8 million pounds of food annually, if as a maximum, right? So they gave us sort of an order of magnitude of what could be provided even within the boundaries of the city. With designers who, in many cases, when we teach landscape architecture, we don't often talk about food systems or agriculture or even rural communities. So, what's required to, put people in situations where you have honest conversations, where you're communicating ideas, where people feel empowered to respond to them. A lot of it has to do with going to each other's places. We're in the high house learning about growing tomatoes in this particular environment. Then they come to the studio and we start to talk about bigger and broader ideas. And, what we uncover is that they're just like where you all are in Michigan, they were underutilized, being closed and vacant school facilities, which still are connected to infrastructure, which still have industrial scale kitchens, which have open spaces associated with them that used to be playgrounds or play fields, how those could be completely transformed to suit the needs of these new systems. And these catalytic projects, how do you get it started? So public art and pollinator gardens and other things that don't require as much infrastructure, but then visualizing how those could morph and transform into more productive landscapes. And I guess the good news of this particular project is that it was able to persuade the county to allow shared use of one of their school facilities, and now grow is, no pun intended, growing, into a larger facility so they can meet the needs of their communities. One last story and we'll close on this section. We've spent a lot of time here with hurricanes. You all are blessed and don't have to deal with that, but where we are in North Carolina, I've been hit with 5 and 3 that you would call a 500-year event since I've been here. So it's a terrible thing. Mostly hits the eastern part of our state, which is the poorest part of our state. There's one town in particular that after Hurricane Matthew in 2017 that we worked with on resilience and recovery called Princeville. Princeville, founded in 1865 as Freedom Hill, was the first town founded by free African Americans in the country. So historically, nationally, it's a significant resource. This is actually a screenshot from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, who included it in their Grounds for Democracy program. The unfortunate component is it's built in the floodplain of the Tar River, which makes it particularly vulnerable to flooding, hurricane or not. Images of the town, the black and white, sadly, many of those historic images have been lost due to hurricane damage and recurring flooding. But the spirit of the people moving forward and pioneering, some of the strategies that we know well, facilitating workshops, bringing groups together, those are all things that are really important. But we tried another thing that I think ties to this capabilities approach, and I think may be useful as a way of framing. We hired local people, paid a living wage to help them help us develop a tour, a cultural trail tour of this particular town, and attracted customers. So there were high school kids from surrounding schools who never even heard of Princeville. So we were able to build their capacity to talk about really the great value of their oral history, their narrative, in real time with the next generation, who is most important in terms of carrying forward a lot of these stories and a lot of this history. We brought the kids into the classroom and started to talk about, this cultural landscape and this cultural narrative as an entry point, a gateway to learning about what we do as landscape architects. So how do we start to read the land? How do we start to set priorities? How do we start to photograph and document things? How do you read a map? How do you visualize alternatives? Taught them all digital technologies, including virtual reality and SketchUp modeling and that kind of stuff. So it's not a guarantee that they'll all become landscape architects, but learning that design thinking process, going all the way back to, Spern when I was in college, applying it to an issue that was important to them, hopefully will provide them with multiple skills as they move forward. The end of this particular story, but really the beginning of another story is as a bunch of teenagers who are very frustrated, right? So if you know any teenagers, then you'll understand that keeping them out for hours in a place with no bathrooms and no water and no food and no Wi-Fi is probably dangerous. But we did it anyway. This museum was the original museum of the town, which used to be a trailhead, so that people who visited the town would know where they are, where they're going, get background history. It was still under repair when they were there. One of the kids dreams up this idea of a museum on wheels. And what if we could move it when a flood comes? Which in the beginning sounded, like a wonderful idea, but really naive. But after conversations with our head of School of Architecture, negotiations with our design build studio and our supporters there, our donors, negotiated with the town of Princeville, in particular, seeing whether or not they'd be interested in it. 10 weeks later, there's a mobile museum. So it started with the seed of an idea of how do we use it to evade um, risk, but then grows up to the other capabilities it could afford. You could take this anywhere you want. If you wanted to lobby for more resources to protect communities from flooding and investment and resilience, you could do that. If you wanted to bring it to a festival, you could do that. So it's starting to have its own life now, and it's starting to seed a lot of other elements and resources. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut to the end and say our next territory is how do we measure it and systematize it and promote it, disseminate it, so that this is a part of our regular business. We're considering all these capabilities. Again, referencing the Landscape Architecture Foundation, we've had the Landscape Performance Series and the case study investigations for many years. We're now pivoting to start talking about, well, how do you measure these issues of equity, of justice, of social impacts as robustly as we do with water and energy and habitat and those kinds of factors. So I would direct you there. And again, just to close, I would just a quick tip of the hat that, one of the board members of LAF and a great landscape architect, Alexa Bush, has been very active with Reimagining Civic Commons. Her work with the Kresge Foundation with sharing her on, because we think that's going to be the leading edge in terms of how we start to evaluate these different pieces. And we'll close out with a shameless plug. So today we started the publicity campaign for our Summit 2 for Landscape Architecture Foundation, which will be Saturday, April 9th at the National Building Museum. We spent the last year and a half really looking at the Green New Deal as a framework for thinking about how to integrate jobs, justice, and decarbonization through the landscape and through thousands of participants across dozens of countries, multiple ways of interfacing from online to in person. We have this incredible collection and array of strategies and ideas, many also from Michigan. So thank you to the people from Michigan who participate in this particular program. We're gathering together and able to both celebrate all of that great momentum, but also the grounding is real, meaning that how do we make these approaches and strategies tangible, palatable, and actionable from a policy perspective, from a design perspective. We want to start to keep moving forward on those grand challenges. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Kofi. It was so fascinating to hear both sort of your personal story and development through time juxtaposed with larger narratives, as well as examples of initiatives happening around the country. So it's really rich and thought-provoking. Really appreciate you bringing all of that to the table. For participants, please submit your questions in the Q&A in the chat for Kofi as we go. But I'd love to start with a question that you sort of brought to mind for me. I thought that the idea of landscape as a scaffold upon which you can build capabilities for communities was really powerful. But then you also talked about the fact that there's also landscape as a scaffold for risk. There's the Olmsted project that both created opportunities but also obliterating communities in the process. So, I guess my my question is, in all of your examples, are there key characteristics of a project or initiative that will create capabilities rather than increasing risks, and how do you weigh those against each other as you take these steps forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And um, there are a couple of factors. In the interest of time, I cut them, but I'm happy to share resources after the talk. One thing that seems to be coming up is the importance of time, and the ability to be patient, and allow communities to build their capabilities before a shock to the system that's coming. So, one project we do talk about is the 11th Street Bridge Park project in Washington, D.C., a decommissioned highway bridge that is being turned into a park, designed by OMA, Rem Koolhaas's shop in Olin, the great landscape architecture firm based in Philadelphia. But they have an equitable development plan, and they've set a lot of goals for what you might call community readiness, which is to say that they don't think they can prevent private property values from increasing after this public investment, but they can do a lot of work before that happens that starts to prepare the community to hopefully benefit from that investment as opposed to getting displaced. And so they have this whole pre-construction sort of window where they're, starting to cultivate small business enterprises and invest in workforce development, deal with stabilizing housing, particularly legacy housing in those particular communities, helping renters convert to owners, a lot of work in arts and culture, and during construction and post-construction. So they have these time horizons. Originally, I thought it was a 10-year plan, but according to Scott Kratz, the director of the 11th Street Bridge Park project, talked to him last week. He was like, no, we don't have an end game to it. We have 10 years for a community land trust we're trying to develop, but we're monitoring this thing quarterly to see how it's performing. So the first thing is sort of a time thing. The second thing is monitoring. And I think that often in our projects, there isn't a budget for what we call post-occupancy evaluation, right? To evaluate how things are changing after we're done. But I think that there are foundations and philanthropies that are more interested in that. I mentioned Alexa earlier, the Kresge Foundation. They've been involved with that Reimagine the Civic Commons process that has adopted pilot cities all over the country to really evaluate what our investments in public space is doing to all kinds of systems. So, what are they doing to socioeconomic mixing, as an example, right? Are you attracting like people from a very narrow niche in terms of their skill set or level of income or whatever, or is it more diverse? What's it doing with regards to civic participation? Like, is it helping people organize and build coalitions, get them more active, voting in public policy or not? They're asking some really interesting questions, and they've offered some methodologies on how to do that. But again, it's something that requires time. So I think that those are some examples that I think might be useful to other people.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely hear you talking a lot about a sort of holistic effort that involves maybe things that are outside of our usual way of thinking, that think about the economic context, think a lot about the history and the financial, the financial implications of what goes into a long-term benefit for the community as well.
Mhm.
Is your work at the Black Land Loss Project related to that, and how did that get started? If you could talk a little bit about that initiative.
Yeah, so no, I didn't start it. It's
Okay.
primarily a legal initiative. So they've been around for a couple of decades. The group provides legal aid to Black farmers that are at risk of losing their land through the abbreviated version with Black land loss in the presentation. The long version is farming. I don't know how many people are on the call are farmers or related to farmers, but it's extremely hard work, high risk, and very thin margins of profits. So you get like bad weather or infestation of disease, or the market turns on a crop that you're growing. I mean, it's just really, really tough. So a lot of farmers, at least down here, have a lot of debt, and where we are, there are air rights with property where, as opposed to a will that instructs someone with what to do um, with the land when you die, so you own the land, an equal share goes to each living heir, which sounds cool on one level, but on the other side, legally, it's very difficult, and it's very easy for people to abuse and exploit that as a loophole to um, gain control of land that they don't own and kick a family out. So the long version this is the long version. The short version is we provide legal aid to those families, and we advocate for policy changes to help them hold on to and protect their land. And so we have a very dynamic CEO who is actually a consultant now to the USDA as they're trying to make systemic change there. I got involved, by the way, because of an article, since it's sort of a nerdy academic thing. Wrote an article about some of the topics that were in that show, and they were like, hey, you should be on the board. And so, it's just, it's just that. I guess it resonated with them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. You seem to be, have your work spread all over the country and in so many different realms, and it's really, really fascinating to see.
I'm old. Yeah, so
all over
your
the
time
place.
is coming. Your time is coming.
Another question we got, maybe we can wrap up with this one, is how do you suggest that emerging professionals get involved with this kind of systematic change, whether it's the kinds of things you're involved in, or whether it's through the means of private practice, or whatever you think that might look like?
I think that's a really good question. When I was in that period in my life, I asked that question a lot. So the first thing I would say is to either join an organization or get organized in some way. So sometimes the scale of things that are required for systemic change can feel overwhelming, and it can kind of push you the other way, right? It can say, well, I'm not going to engage with that kind of stuff. I'm just going to put the blinders on and deal with what I can deal with. But I think that there are others out there that are interested in this kind of stuff. So as an example, ASLA Adapts was sort of a grassroots group of emerging designers who were very frustrated with the professional organization at that time. This is like 5-6 years ago, when we really, as the professional organization, did not directly address climate change at all, right? Didn't require any training in it, didn't require any skill development, nothing in curriculum, and definitely not projects. And so today, just in that short period of time, it's completely flipped to, the ASLA has done some serious reorganization to kind of address that particular issue. And that came from organized action from people who dealt with that. So I would say organizing is number one. And the other one is, I think what we do technically, we often take for granted. And I've been in a lot of community situations where the basic stuff that we do, from how we visualize stuff, to how we analyze stuff, to our understanding of codes and other things, it's like a foreign language to a lot of people. And there are a lot of people who want to make physical change, but just don't know how. And so I would say, don't discount that skill set that you have. Don't get frustrated if you can't use it all the time, but understand it's valuable. And when the time comes and you're in the right spot, step into it, with confidence and with passion.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a nuanced answer, which I really appreciate, because it's a hard question. So yeah, thank you so much for taking your time. I really enjoyed hearing you speak, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. For everyone on the call, I'm going to put a link to our webinar series, where you can find other recordings as well as this one, which will be posted soon. And we hope that you can all join us for future webinars. So thank you again, Kofi. And
thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.